Hi everyone, welcome to episode number 8 in this series of videos, Is Marxism Still a Thing? So today we'll be exploring a possible balance between Marxist philosophy and liberal philosophy, and we're still following the structure in this book. The print version is in Portuguese, but you can purchase the ebook version in English via the link in the description or in the bio if you're viewing this on Instagram. So is there a way to combine the concern of Marxism for the most vulnerable in society, to combine that concern with the liberal emphasis on individual rights and individual responsibility, the so-called meritocracy, which is a system where one doesn't simply get handed by the state what one needs, but is encouraged to work hard to ascend socially. Of course, there are attempts at finding a balance, but let us say right from the outset that China is not one of those attempts. China simply opened up economically in order to be able to grow economically while continuing to be a totalitarian state, suppressing freedom of speech, suppressing individual rights. So not a liberal country at all. But is balance possible? The early socialist theorists seem to think so. So they envisioned a system where social justice would be achievable. And a big difference between socialism and communism is that the socialist theorists, they didn't believe in armed revolution, they didn't believe in violence to achieve social transformation. So they had their utopia, and so this type of socialism is called utopian socialism by the socialist theorists themselves. And they envisioned a system where leadership would be fluid. So there would be rotating leadership, not a totalitarian oligarchy with few maintaining power during decades. Moreover, wealth would be equally distributed to all, and this is, of course, something that inspired Marx and Marxist philosophy. So health would be equally distributed to all by the state, but they would allow for the existence of private property with limitations. Of course, everything would be administered by the state. So, but because of their moderation, because of their refraining from advocating violence, they were called utopian socialists. And Marx didn't think they were realists at all. They were realistic at all. Marx he thought that you couldn't achieve social justice or transformation without violence, without blood. So these early socialists, they laid the foundations for what became the system in Europe after the Second World War. Social democracy was inspired in part in these socialist ideals. So it's the European model, and the European model worked very well. At least it seems like the balance was indeed found. Of course, a very imperfect balance, but the European model envisioned a peaceful social democracy. This means that there was no totalitarianism, no totalitarian regimes. In social democracy, people would be free to elect their representatives, and no violence would be a part of the system. No violence would be advocated as a means to achieve social improvement. Moreover, a non-totalitarian, as we said, socialist matrix and a liberal matrix as well, with individual rights, social protection of the vulnerable, but individual rights and entrepreneurship, so encouragement for the individual to work hard and ascend socially, and of course regulation of markets by the state. This balance, of course, it's always an imperfect balance. For humans, nothing that we do is ever balanced. So in balance, happens indeed, as we all know, if the imbalance bends towards the side of liberalism, it produces, like we've seen, ultra-liberalism. It produces, like we've seen in the example of the financial crisis of 2008, both in the United States and in the West in general, because the political power couldn't regulate or didn't want to regulate the financial markets. So the markets regulated themselves, and we all saw the result of that. But there are also imbalances towards the side of socialism, and we all know the fruits of that as well. For example, individuals that exceedingly depend on the state, on state subsidies, on state benefits, lack of entrepreneurship. So individuals, they see their livelihood guaranteed by the state, so they tend to become very comfortable with that and not willing to risk very much. So entrepreneurship is a sign. Lack of entrepreneurship is a sign of an imbalance towards the side of socialism, of social protection. And of course, the lack of social responsibility is also fostered by an exaggeration in the socialist ideals, in social democracy, in social democratic countries. So it's undeniable that liberalism and social democracy, indeed, they produced free societies, and the West is a proof of that. The whole system of Western society, and communism never even came close to creating a society like that. But it's also clear that it's necessary to have a more socialist counterweight in order for the protection of the vulnerable to be ensured by the state, because we all know that when profit is the greatest goal, yes, it can improve life of individuals, but it can, of course, like we talked about in the capitalist jungle, it can very easily leave those that are more vulnerable behind. And so social democracy, in fact, there's an attempt, at least, to not allow for any of those things to happen. But although the system works, or has worked reasonably, there is, of course, with many flaws, but there is today a general discontentment with social democracy in general, and with the liberal system in Western democracies. And so we see the rise of so-called alt-right parties. We see the extremes. We see the polarization of Western society. We see the rise of parties in Europe, and also and we see the rise of a kind of speech that is very combative. Combative against what? There's a cultural war, a war of values between the left and the right, and that's visible in today's politics, in today's society. Moderate positions are no longer the rule, or at least they're losing strength, because these groups, these movements, these so-called alt-right movements, they perceive Western values to be endangered by these left-wing movements that have been speaking against things that are a fundamental part of Western civilization, like the family, like science, like nuclear family, like science, like freedom of speech, like sexuality, like gender, like masculinity. So there's a whole set of values that the left is trying to push, the radical left. There's the radical left on one side, there's the alt-right on the other side. Of course, this term alt-right is not accepted by these movements. Maybe it's not the best term, maybe we could call it just right, because the right, the ideals of the right are seen to be defended by these groups and movements, but they use a term to define all these, like this package that the left-wing movements are trying to bring to civilization, to Western civilization, and they call it cultural Marxism. And this is the topic indeed of this whole podcast, and this is what we will be looking at in the next for the rest of this podcast, in the next episode. So stay tuned. That's it for today, and don't forget, live with Christ at the center.